The Campbell Street Story. The Campbell Street Story is the collective story of both the people who lived in the Campbell Street corridor and the people who lived elsewhere, but whose daily lives were centered on Campbell Street. For more than a century, the Campbell Street corridor was the center of African American life and culture in Camden. It was on Campbell Street that the city's African American children and teens were educated at the Jackson schools, both the elementary and the high school. Parents who decided to educate their children at a private school could choose between the Browning Home Mather Academy on Campbell Street or the Camden Second Presbyterian Church School just a few blocks away on Market Street. Religious life also centered on and around Campbell Street. African American Methodists attended Trinity United Methodist Church, now known as Camden First United Methodist Church, just around the corner on DeKalb Street. The Baptists worshipped at Mount Moriah, just 2 blocks away from Campbell on Broad Street. The Presbyterians ventured 3 blocks away from Campbell to attend Camden Second Presbyterian Church on Market Street. Many of Camden's African American entrepreneurs and professionals own businesses in the bustling downtown business district just 2 blocks from Campbell Street. When a loved one's journey on earth ended, many African American families turned to Collins Funeral Home, located on the corner of Campbell and DeKalb Streets, for help with the final rites. Hundreds of solemn funeral processions wound their way along Campbell Street to Cedars Cemetery for internment in the historic African American cemetery, to lay for eternity among generations of their Camden forebears. As the suburbs grew in the 1950s and people began to move further from the center of Camden, Campbell Street was no longer as readily identified as a center of African American life. By retelling the Campbell Street story, we aim to rekindle the memories of Campbell Street's place in the life of the African American people of Camden. If we are to really understand Camden's history, we must understand Campbell Street's history. This exhibit is the beginning of that important story. Number 1. The Revolutionary War. Campbell Street's early history is significant. Surveyors laid out the original town lots on a grid sometime before 1774. On Camden's earliest known map, the portion of Campbell Street south of York Street was one of the original streets. During the Revolutionary War, the British occupied Camden's western defenses on Campbell Street. They placed 2 redoubts on Campbell Street, one in the middle of the road south of Bull Street, and one on the eastern edge of Campbell on what is now residential land between King and Calhoun Streets. A redoubt is defined as an isolated earthwork forming a complete enclosure used to defend a prominent position. In this case, the palisaded walls the British built around Camden. Number 3. Cedars Cemetery. The early beginnings of this burial ground for the colored people of Camden are lost in the mist of time. Tradition holds that the owner of the land upon which it stands allowed a burial on the tract at some unknown date, and thereafter the land continued to be used for internments of African Americans. The earliest dated headstone in the burying ground is proof that the cemetery was well established by the 1840s. We are unsure at this time where people of color were buried earlier in Camden's history. In 1962, the McGirth, later McGirt, family signed a quitclaim deed over to the Colored People's Cemetery Association for the city lots occupied by the cemetery. At that time, the name was changed to Cedars Cemetery. Cedars Cemetery is hallowed ground. We may never know the exact number of Camden citizens who rest in that ground, for many graves are unmarked. Others have stones ranging from simple handmade markers to elaborately artist-engraved monuments. The lives of those who rest here tell the story of the people of color through the ages in Camden. Number 4. Haydoth Lodge Number 250, Free and Accepted Masons, Prince Hall Affiliation. In 1919, African American men founded Haydoth Lodge Number 250, Free and Accepted Masons, Prince Hall Affiliation. The lodge's first Grand Master was P.B. Madodana, the principal at Jackson High School. Members erected the present building in 1949 when Amon R. Collins of Collins Funeral Home served as the Grand Master of the lodge. The Prince Hall lodges are primarily African American lodges. Prince Hall, a free person of color in Boston, was attracted to Freemasonry because of its ideals of liberty, equality, and peace. In 1775, Prince Hall and 14 other free black men petitioned the Grand Lodge of Ireland for membership into Freemasonry after Boston's St. John's Lodge refused to accept them as members. In 1784, Prince Hall and his fellow Masons established African Lodge No. 1 in Boston. All of the African American Prince Hall lodges in the United States grew out of this lodge. Number 5. Boylan Haven Mather Academy. The Women's Home Missionary Society of the Methodist Church established Browning Home and Mather Academy in 1887 as a model home and industrial school for children of former slaves. The teachers taught their students a broad curriculum, which included literature, music, art, drama, sports, journalism, and Bible study. Homemaking skills were also an important part of the curriculum. The school was located on 27 acres, originally purchased by Sarah Babcock in 1867. The main building of the school, which stood on the southwest corner of DeKalb and Campbell Streets, was the old Lang Plantation House, built in 1814 by Thomas Lang. The school educated both boarding students and day students for 96 years before closing in 1983. Through the years, other Methodist schools combined with Mather Academy. The Haven Industrial Home and School in Savannah and the Boylan School in Jacksonville, Florida, merged with Mather in 1959. Mather Academy taught students in grades 1 through 11 through 1927. In 1928, the school added grade 12. At some point in time, a kindergarten was also added. This private school had a profound impact on generations of young people. Number 6. Public Library for Coloreds. Until 1947, the only library for African Americans in Camden was the private library at Mather Academy. Mather's Russell Memorial Library had 2,500 books. Former students remember checking out books so that non-students could read them. In 1947, the Kershaw County Library Commission began plans for opening a Negro unit of the library. This unit for library services was set up in a section of the Jackson School Teen Canteen. The repository opened on May 1, 1947, with 631 books and 700 library card holders. The need was obviously great. Planning soon began for a new building to house the Negro Library. The groundbreaking for the new library was held in June of 1950. At that time, Kershaw County was the only county in the state with library services for the colored population. Number 7. The Jackson Schools. Camden's first public school for African Americans was built on Jackson Square in 1867. This frame school building stood on Campbell Street between DeKalb and Lafayette Streets. The first building was replaced in 1893 when Jackson School became part of the graded school system. Jackson School was a 2-story frame building with 6 classrooms and a wide hallway, as well as a large auditorium. The school served grades 1 through 9 until 1924. After that, only the elementary school continued to be held in this old frame building. In 1923, construction began on a new facility for Jackson High School. This 1-story brick building, completed in 1924, faced DeKalb Street and held classes for 8th grade through 10th grade. The 11th grade was added in 1925. During the Great Depression, the Works Progress Administration built a new brick elementary school to replace the old 1893 2-story frame structure on Campbell Street. Built with a combination of Rosenwald school funds and public funds, this 2-story brick school building was completed in 1936. This later became the high school building. Number 8. Collins Funeral Home. Elizabeth Collins purchased the land and property at 714 DeKalb Street on the corner of DeKalb and Campbell Streets in 1898. Elizabeth's son, Amon Collins, began Collins Funeral Home in 1914. He operated it out of a small building on the grounds of the present funeral home. He later moved the businesses to his residences at 10,014 and 10,008 Campbell Street. In the 1950s, the business moved from the Collins family home to its present site. Number 9. Trinity United Methodist Church. We know from a first-person account of life in Camden that in 1804 the black and white Methodists worshiped together in the First Methodist Church building in Camden. The African American Methodist Church in Camden grew out of that congregation. The earliest Methodist sanctuary was a small frame building on King Street in the old part of Camden near the Mills Courthouse. The Methodist congregation built its second church building on West DeKalb Street in 1828. In 1875, the African American congregation purchased this large frame church building for their use after the white congregation built a new church building on Littleton Street. By 1888, the African American congregation had 600 members and was under the care of Reverend J. L. Grice. The frame church on West DeKalb was named Trinity United Methodist Church. This thriving congregation used the 1828 frame church until it was partially destroyed by fire in 1925. The congregation made immediate plans to construct a new church on the site. On Sunday, June 17, 1928, the first services were held in the new sanctuary. The congregation celebrates its 188th year in 2016. Number 11. The E. H. Dibble Store. Eugene Dibble was the son of a prominent African American family in Camden. He served in the South Carolina House of Representatives from 1876 until 1878. He and his brothers became important African American businessmen. The family owned two highly successful general merchandise and grocery stores on Broad Street. Eugene owned and operated the store on the corner of DeKalb and Broad Streets for more than 50 years. His business was part of a thriving black business community in Camden. By the mid-1920s, there were 26 black grocers, 3 restaurants operated by blacks, and 5 black-owned filling and service stations in town. Numerous barber shops, bakeries, butchers, seafood markets, and blacksmith shops were owned by black proprietors. Eugene and his family also acquired much real estate in Camden and can be credited with the development of the Campbell Street corridor, selling 24 lots on that street as well as 10 lots on Gordon Street between the years 1900 and 1940. Number 12. Mount Moriah Baptist Church. On Sunday, January 22, 1866, 104 African American members of the Camden Baptist Church, now known as First Baptist, and the Swift Creek Baptist Church met on the site of the present church building to form a new congregation. Each had letters of dismissal from their former congregations, and so this new congregation formed with the blessings of the older, established Baptist congregations in Camden. Officers of Camden Baptist Church and members of the American Baptist Home Mission Society assisted with the establishment of the new church. The new church first met in a blacksmith shop located on the site of the present church building. The congregation met twice on January 22, 1866, and formed a committee of 5 to write the church constitution and plan for the organization period. On Monday, January 23rd, they reconvened and chose the name Mount Moriah and adopted their constitution. Monroe Boykin was chosen as the first minister. Though not trained as a minister, he had spiritual gifts which were apparent to the congregation. Reverend Boykin led the church for 35 years until his retirement in 1901. Mount Moriah Baptist Church celebrates its 150th anniversary in 2016. Number 13. Camden Second Presbyterian Church. Camden's Second Presbyterian Church grew out of a Sunday school established in 1890 by two men affiliated with Johnson C. Smith University in Charlotte, North Carolina. This Sunday school was held in the home of Robert Boykin, which stood across Market Street from the present church building. The Sunday school thrived. Classes for both adults and children were held in the morning. As time progressed, worship services were held on Sunday afternoons at the Boykin home. The classes and worship attendance soon outgrew the room in the house, and classes and services were moved to the Boykin yard. About 1893, members of the Sunday school petitioned Fairfield Presbytery for permission to organize a church. A Johnson C. Smith University graduate, Reverend William Randolph Muldrow, became the church's minister in 1903. Reverend Muldrow's ministry oversaw the organization of a private, non-denominational day school at the church. In 2016, Camden's Second Presbyterian Church celebrates 126 years of Christian education and service in Camden. Number 14. Bond's Conway House. This little house, one of the oldest in Camden, was likely constructed about 1812 by Bond's Conway. It once stood at 411 York Street on property owned by the Conway family from 1812 to 1890. Bond's Conway is thought to be the first slave to have bought his freedom in Camden. This occurred in 1793 when Bonds paid £87 for his freedom. Many descendants of Bonds Conway and his wife Dorcas lived on Campbell Street. The Bonds Conway house is a wonderful example of a vernacular small dwelling constructed in Camden during the early 19th century. The Bonds Conway house was in great disrepair when the Kershaw County Historical Society acquired it in 1977 and began a several-year restoration after moving it to its present location at 811 Fair Street. It now serves as the office for the Historical Society.